Back then, the only sort of technology which was available for the masses was speech to text. But if you wanted to analyze different markers within speech, like hey, how you speak, right? Those were missing. And that's where we realized that there is a large sort of space which is business communications, where you want to analyze what people are talking about. But for your initial set of customers, you want to be creative in terms of hey, you should know who is your end goal, who is your end user, and you kind of want to target them.
Okay, welcome Sushant. It's great to have you on the AM Media House podcast Simulated Reality. It's been a fun time for me in the Bay Area. I've met different people in their AI careers at different stages. The previous interview I did was with someone who has just done a startup and raised funds. You've raised funds, scaled your startup, and then exited, or not exited, but gotten acquired by RingCentral. So it'll be interesting to learn your journey as well and how it works. It in fact is very fascinating and gives a view into into personas into the valley, right? And how they are kind of, because for us in Bangalore, or when I was back in Pune, it's very interesting to hear about the entire Silicon Valley and this thing, and to kind of get a perspective into this is really fun. And a great learning, and I'm sure our audience also finds it fun. Let's start by understanding DeepAffects, right?
Sure.
What was the idea? You said you did a lot of to and fro. You started it in India, then you did it, and then it was acquired by RingCentral. Let's walk us through the journey a little bit and help us understand your thought process behind starting it and then getting it acquired by.
Awesome, yeah, totally. And this is, of course, a topic which is very near and dear to all of us. So I'll give a little bit of background. Before DeepAffects, I was also working for a startup again, graduated from IIT Bombay, and always was interested in taking the path which was not typically taken by people, right? You don't want to join Google, you want to try something. What's the worst that can happen? That was sort of the idea, and so that's where I met my other co-founder. He was actually a founder of that original company called Lumiata. We were into predictive healthcare analytics, and so from there I essentially had built the whole AI org there, where we were focusing on analyzing massive US healthcare data. And then we had, from a technology standpoint, amazing challenge. Like healthcare is super exciting, but we also faced a lot of interesting challenges in terms of just lack of adoption from bigger healthcare, hospitals, insurance providers. Just the cycle was too long, and it was sort of not super exciting for us. And then we decided maybe we want to try something else. So that's when we quit Lumiata and decided that, hey, let's focus on something. So back in Lumiata, we also had a lot of interesting contacts in terms of healthcare industry. So we were working with this UCSF, and we are sort of trying to help them around this problem of predicting depression between college students. Most students don't seek help, and so how do you are there ways to identify markers for depression within your voice, like when people are calling, so that sort of stuff. And so when we started working on that problem, we realized that there is a lot of foundational aspects of AI that are missing when we wanted to process speech. Back then, the only sort of technology which was available for the masses was speech to text. But if you wanted to analyze different markers within speech, like hey, how you speak, right? Those were missing. And so we dived deeper into it, and then realized that there is a foundational layer which needs to happen beyond speech to text, which can help us analyze a lot of this data. And so we started exploring, like the first problem which we faced was, hey, the recordings which we had were single channel. So just like this podcast, there is a recording with two speakers, but we don't know who is speaking when. We had to split this. And the original thought was, hey, this should be a fairly straightforward problem. I'm sure somebody has already solved this or worked on this. And then once we started diving deeper into it, we realized that there is no solution beyond academia for this particular aspect of the problem. And academia solutions were all based on academic data sets. They did not really scale well on like real world challenges of speech. Noisy data, lack of good quality data. So that's when we started focusing on, we were a startup being a startup, we were like, so this is called speaker diarization. And so we are like,
Speaker what, sorry?
Diarization.
Diarization.
Yeah.
How do you spell it?
DIARIZATION.
Okay.
So it's a very technical term, but what it
Yeah.
essentially means is you're splitting this audio into like who spoke when chunks. Right?
Yeah. Okay.
So like we had a website, we just added like, hey, speaker. We were sort of dabbling with creating different APIs, and so we just created our website, added this like speaker direction API as part of it, and then it was pretty interesting that there were a lot of hits to that particular page. Like we realized that there are a lot of people who are, this is a fairly, you have never heard of this word. So it's a fairly, if somebody's coming to our website for this particular search string, it definitely means that they know what they're looking for and they're sort of looking for this. And that's when we sort of came with like fit to the market, like, hey, there are people out there who are sort of looking for this as a service. And then that's where, we started doing all of the engineering. We created the whole like, hey, how do we now solve this problem? Not just for 2 people, but can we do it for a video meeting, right?
Yeah.
Can we gracefully solve it for 4 people in a meeting, 8 people in a meeting?
Much more bigger
Yeah.
use case, business use case.
Exactly. And so that's where we realized that there is a large sort of space, which is business communications, where you want to analyze what people are talking about. And there has been a fundamental challenge on how you could analyze this data. And so we ended up starting like creating this foundational layer of not just what was being spoken, but who spoke what, when, and how. Like who spoke what and how are they speaking, like emotion, how are they sort of expressing those things. And so we created this whole suite of APIs for telling you anything and everything that you would potentially need from this given meeting recordings or audio recording. And we had like very interesting use cases. Podcast was just also getting pretty active back then, as people are running their podcast, but transcripts of the podcast were not very accurate, and you wanted like who spoke when data within the podcast as well. And so contact centers was another massive use case for us, is like, hey, what is the customer speaking, what is the agent speaking? And so that sort of created the whole DeepAffects story.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And when does and why does a startup or a founder decide to get acquired? What are some of the factors that make sense when you decide to get acquired and when you should not get acquired?
Yeah, so for us it was also pretty interesting, and in hindsight it basically becomes like we were at the right place at the right time. COVID just happened, and suddenly the technology that we were working on suddenly had massive use cases. Voice communication for companies like RingCentral, Zoom. Overnight they had like phenomenal set of users who were coming in because businesses needed employees to talk to each other. And so RingCentral was a customer of ours back then, where they just launched this video product, and they were sort of trying to do, hey, can we do some AI along with it, right? Since then we had also built a lot more on our API stack. We sort of dabbled with summarization of meetings. Again, this was back in like 2017-18. So Transformers era, where interesting things were happening, but pre-LLM era, right? So there was no one model which could solve all the problems. So we did a lot of like cool engineering to try and summarize meetings. So for us, it was an interesting mix where we had a very interesting technology, but of course, as a startup, we knew that we needed for this technology to reach out masses, we needed a really great distribution, which we did not have. And so that was one of our key decision making factor for us, is, hey, do we sort of stay as an API company where we sort of focus on different use cases, or do we sort of sit together with a communications platform, become a native part of the communication platform, and with the potential of completely revamping how communication happens, right?
So
And
who approached who then for the acquisition? You pitched it to
RC basically. So they were a customer of ours. They were sort of using our APIs, and then they sort of were also interested in, is, hey, can we have a long-term collaboration where either as a strong, like, we build something special for them, or eventually which panned out to just us getting an acquisition from them.
That's pretty cool. And how do you start off this, right? So one of the questions that I often get from many people who now want to start AI companies, and rightly so because of the demand, and there are so many. But when I was an engineering student, I always wondered, how do I at least start off so that I understand the conceptualization behind the problem statement, and then finding a long-term solution that can scale and find a home in various enterprises. But the part where you kind of start working with customers. So let's say there's a aspiring entrepreneur in IIT Bombay today, or let's say VIT Pune, the college which I studied. How do they start kind of reaching out and working with some of the top executives in the Silicon Valley? How do you get that access?
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting problem, right? So the good thing is a lot of enterprises today now, because of the AI hype, they are more approachable. If you have an interesting enough technology, you might have some doors open. Like they might not want to buy it outright, or
Cold
they might.
emails work?
Cold emails definitely work. For us, what also helped was, for us, it was a mix of just being, they were looking for something which we were offering and nobody else was offering, which was kind of unique in our case, but not necessarily which happens always. But it's a mix of two, right? One is you do have to reach out to a lot of places, especially like, for example, if you're from IIT Bombay, your network is so amazing. Like the IIT Bombay community here in the Bay Area is phenomenal. Like you can literally find an executive on every single company that you would think of. You will find some contacts within the network, right? And so that's one of the best ways to sort of also get those intros going in. And in general, people are super helpful. Like they will be out there happy to help. We have all of these events happening, and so alumni networks definitely help to open some doors. Like if you're right out of college, of course you don't have your own network, so you tap into this alumni network to get into that. If you have some experience, or maybe one of the founders has a larger industry experience, they can sort of use their own sort of social contacts to open up some of the doors. But cold calling, or rather cold emailing, just really creative LinkedIn emails also work. We got a lot of our customers by doing a lot of these, the things that don't scale well. But for your initial set of customers, you want to be creative in terms of, hey, you should know who is your end goal, who is your end user, and you kind of want to target them.
That's pretty cool. Actually, that's a good insight, because it's still, startup world is not. So yesterday I was invited to a partner company, a VC partner company to just attend. But then I met, one or two VCs and some of the young entrepreneurs who had just started off, their journey. But it's very daunting to even imagine that it's possible in a lot of ways for some people, and I think this gives a lot of insight. But let us talk about a little bit on how these startups work as well, right? So you have worked, and I want to talk from the perspective of AI specifically. You have built an app in a scalable product in AI, and you've worked in a startup. At that point in time, probably it was just you and your co-founder, on a journey, on a mission to build a product which entices people, which excites people. And I'm sure it was very different when working on very limited resources. You were probably doing finance and the HR and everything around it. The legal work, and some consultant you might hire here and there, a lawyer or something, but apart from that, you'll have to do it from scratch. But on the other hand, a company like RingCentral, scaling AI, the different sets of problems. Can you define the difference in these sets of challenges that are there? I'm sure that it's not easy here as well. Every day there's challenges. But what are those? How are these challenges different?
I would approach in two categories, right? One is money. As a startup, depending on how much money you have raised, you may or may not have a lot of money. So you may or may not have access to GPUs, right? Which is kind of becomes a limiting factor to what you can do as a potential AI company. But then again, there are a lot of creative ways here to get GPU access. Like you have Google Cloud credits, you have AWS credits. They give you enough credits to sort of shuttle around. And we were still doing a lot of like deep tech where we really needed to train our own models. And we did like a lot of creative stuff. We basically started off on GCP, migrate all our workloads at AWS when we got AWS credits, migrate all the workloads to Azure when we got Azure credits. So we just built this whole stack, which kind of was so easy to migrate all on and off clouds. For us, it was just a matter of like, okay, we have credits, we have a lot of credits here, let's just, use this. So that is like one way where, because you don't have a lot of like capital, you kind of need to be creative in terms of how you train your models. Now, I think there are still some changes which with LLMs, you may or may not necessarily need to train your own models. So that bottleneck has gone a lot. But it also means that you can no longer work on superficial items because it's so easy for somebody else also to do the same thing. So you really need to dive deeper into the problem statement, try to figure out exactly where you are adding the value, right, as a company. So like that is one aspect of it. Engineering, of course, involves like, hey, how do you actually do this well? And then the other aspect is data, right? Is how do you get data? Where do you get the data from? You cannot purchase data. You don't have enough money to purchase data. How do you sort of get the good quality data that you care about? And there is, of course, like ways to generate data. And now we are at an interesting point where generated data itself is becoming like a category in itself, right?
Yeah.
People are sort of creating superficial data, and which is good enough, and training models.
Synthetic data, yeah.
So synthetic data itself. So those were the key challenges which we had. Of course, talent being the biggest one of them is, hey, how do you convince somebody to join your company when you don't have anything? Exactly. And so that's where I think as a founder, like especially if you're like a great engineer, the biggest skill that you need to learn is how to sell. And you should be, even if a technical co-founder, you need to sell it to your employees. Like you need to sell it to corresponding engineers who might
You're
join
selling an idea even to your talent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's the art of selling which people don't know, and of course you learn it on the job. No, like I did not know it, and you kind of sort of get into it and then slowly figure out, hey, how do you pitch? The pitch you would give to a VC is entirely different from the pitch that you would give to a prospective employee, and you need to like sort of craft it in a way which sort of matches to what the other end person is looking for, right? On the contrary, like something at like RingCentral scale, we have entirely different challenges in terms of, we start off with like legal reviews. You kind of have, we are a global company, so you have GDPR, you have data residency rules, you have data retention policies. You kind of need to, you cannot sort of build an app in a silo and hope it works, because you have people trust. And the foundation principle, like even within RingCentral, trust is one of the most important factors, because people are using RingCentral phone as the primary line. Like it's like the single point of failure for them. If the phone goes off, business stops, right? And so for us, how do you treat this data carefully? Like how do you ensure that a customer is okay with us running AI models? They need to be aware that nobody has access to this data, only them. Like how do you sort of create this whole pipeline, make sure it scales well? Because as a startup, you don't necessarily need to worry about 1 million concurrency requests. You might not even reach there in an initial stage, but as you go into like at RingCentral scale, we probably process a few million voicemails every single day. These are calls which just did not go through. Like the volume of calls which go through is significantly higher, right? And so which sort of helps us realize, like at this scale, a lot of like decisions which you might have made in earlier sort of days when you are a startup might not necessarily make sense. They won't necessarily scale up at this huge scale.
When you started your company, I'm sure you coded, right? You had to build a model and you do that. Do you still code?
Not as much as I would like, but yes.
What's that difference, right? Moving from a very tactical standpoint. In a startup, you were tactical as well as strategic, right? You had to kind of code and as well as sell ideas to your employees, to your buyers and everyone.
Correct.
Here, probably you're more working at a strategic level. You're drawing a framework, an architect to kind of let your ML engineers, AI engineers follow it. As an AI entrepreneur or an entrepreneur who's building AI solutions, what is that difference in terms of the tactical nature of work versus the strategic nature of work in both when you started off as well as now in RingCentral?
Yeah, amazing question. And I love, we've had a lot of discussions about this within my peer. Like a lot of people are like working into AI, really deep into AI. And one of the common questions that we get often is the pace at which AI is changing is so quickly. Like every day you have new sets of papers coming in. How do you keep up, right?
Yeah.
If you are deeply technical and you're sort of, your day job is reading papers, you might still be able to read some of them, definitely not all of them. But as you like at my current position, I can't even read papers. Like I don't even have time to read all of those papers, right? And so one of the key things is, hey, how do you stay up to date with what's happening within the industry? How do you sort of and there is a lot of hype, right, corresponding with all the AI research. There's amazing research happening, but a lot of it is also just incremental research. So what I have sort of focused a lot on is trying to figure out those points of inflection, right? At what point is something like critically different than what was existed before, which sort of warrants us to actually invest into or sort of do those, right? Those are the points I try to sort of focus on is, hey, and then of course there is a lot of details where you rely on your team to try and sort of figure out, hey, is the marginal like 0.1%, does it really matter much to us? Or, in some cases it does, in some cases it does not. So you sort of make some of those decisions. So for me right now, it's two ways, right? One is staying abreast with, hey, what's happening? And then the second is, how do you sort of now get executive buy-ins? How do you sort of make them aware of, hey, what is this technology shift that's happening in the industry?
Being
and
a thought leader.
Exactly. And how do you sort of position ourselves as a bigger company so that we are able to cash in on this new wave of AI, right?
Yeah. Do you feel worried? And I'll tell you from where I'm coming from, right? So I was a research analyst at some point in time, right? I have also been a data analyst at some point, but I was a research analyst in my previous roles. But as I went to more managerial roles, every time they came up with newer techniques of research, right? While the fundamentals of primary or secondary research are same, the creativity around it or the domain knowledge that you build while building that report is something this thing. I was feeling, right, these people who are working now, they are so smarter, like there's a kind of this thing, and then you are out of touch. You said you don't get time to read research papers, right, as much as you wanted to. And then being that well informed, probably there was a thrill to it, right? Like, being able
definitely.
to talk. You were an academic, you were an engineering graduate from IIT Bombay. So, that is obviously, has been one of your passions, to build product from scratch. How do you, in this case, right, as a leader, as a strategic, while your objectives are slightly different than a coder or a ML developer or a data scientist, keep abreast with some of the latest technologies? Because conversations with leaderships or executives are very superficial sometimes, right? So then how do you kind of keep up with some of the things, or do you just hire people to keep up?
So ideally I would like to hire people to keep up, but unfortunately it's not as easy as that.
Yeah.
But that is definitely one part of it, is you rely on your team to propagate some of this information, right?
Yeah.
Because let's take some examples of LLMs, right? There are so many, even RAG became popular. There are so many techniques of RAGs which became popular. And so I personally have not tried any of them, right? I can dabble around with it, but then that's where you lean in on your team to try and sort of figure out, hey, you do a bunch of these experiments, figure out which works, what does not work, what makes sense, what does not make sense, and why about it, right? And that's where your team composition also matters a lot. And the second part of this is also your peer network, right?
Mm-hmm.
So which helps a lot is, even if I am not personally going and building some of this, but a lot of my peer network is like academics who are now professors, who are now doing some of the state-of-the-art research, right? Now being in touch with these people, being surrounded by them, and just sort of bouncing off ideas helps you understand where the landscape is changing, where things are headed, right?
Yeah.
And you're sort of looking at those. There is a lot of noise. You're just looking for the signal within this noise, right? And I think a lot of it is calibration personally for myself as well. I have also been sort of calibrating my models as to how I filter out signals from this myriad of noise that's happening around. But I feel like I've become much, much better over the years into how I'm able to pick up signals. And part of it is thankful to my great team who really are able to sort of distill some of this information for me.
One of the points that you made in the previous thing was that this application that you built, the product that you built around emotion recognition, was sitting on the shelf, and there are a lot of AI experiments that are sitting on shelves. Academics are very they have a good visibility into some of these products. How do you realize an idea has a potential, in AI. I want to talk from the context of AI, right? And also, how do you realize when the idea does not have potential? What are some of the factors that you look for it? Because scalability is one of the most fundamental issues that a lot of companies are facing.
Correct.
Even they're spending a lot of money in R&D, which is, there's a significant investment, but at the same time, this decision making of when to scale, when to know that this is the product which will this. What are some of the hints that you look for, and what is your advice to some of the newer entrepreneurs?
Yeah, an amazing question again. So I think as engineers, we sort of get into the fallacy of, oh, this is an amazing technology, I need to figure out what to do with this. It's really hard to sort of get away from that mindset, but once you sort of start looking only at a problem's merit, and does not matter whether you need AI for this or not, right? It could just be a literally small for loop which might solve a certain problem, but hey, does a problem exist? Are people willing to pay for a solution for this, right? And this is where you refine your art of figuring out how much of people, when they say they're willing to pay for it, effectively actually end up paying for it, right?
Yeah.
And that's an entirely different, because when you're having a normal conversation, you could have like 10 pinpoints, like we are having this podcast, we like 4 or 5 different things which we can notice, which we can do better as a quality of life. Now, are you willing to pay for that? Would be the question, right? In a grander scheme of things, everybody wants to buy things which make their life easier, but again, it becomes like, is this like a good to have? Is it like a must have? And a customer may or may not always tell you that honestly, and it's up to you to kind of figure out, hey, what are those signals to judge whether this makes sense or not. Once you sort of zone in on the problem, then how do you come up with a solution for this problem becomes like the secondary aspect of it. Is even for us, back when we were doing DeepAffects, we kind of stumbled upon a problem. We were not looking for the problem. We stumbled upon a problem, then realized like, oh, this is a much bigger problem than we thought it was, which may not happen always. But in general, it's about looking for those things, right? As an engineer, our workflows are so common. We kind of do a lot of things, and a lot of these are annoying things which we might want to change. Repetitive tasks, and there is a lot of people who are trying to work on it. But at the end, one of the things that we need to sort of really look for is, for any business to be successful, it needs to make money. If it cannot make money, no matter how much money you raise, and you just delay the decision of how to make money from this, but at the end, it might not work, right? Your chance of success exponentially increase if you are able to make some money out of it. And then whether this is a VC funded, this is a problem for VC scale, or is it a problem for just a lifestyle business, right?
Yeah.
And both of them are great choices. Like, it just depends on how you want to approach them, right? Because there is a lot of problems which, just because of huge amounts of VC capital, you cannot just scale at that point and you just stop. Like, you have to shut it down. But a lot of those problems could really be good as a lifestyle business, where it cannot go at like 1 million X, but it was really a good problem for 100X, and there were enough people who can, build this or who can buy this.
Yeah, this has been a wonderful conversation. My last question to you is very much to the problem statements that you referred to when it comes to being a part of a bigger organization. Emotion recognition through AI. AI is already under scrutiny a lot, right? Emotion recognition, especially, or any kind of... So I'm sure you've seen the documentary Coded Bias, where facial recognition kind of got under the fire a little bit. Considering the varied or the variety of cultures, the variety of ways people express,
Correct.
the varieties of dialogues, the intricacies of a language, different languages, they might impact some of the decision making. I'm sure that this is something that you guys are considering on a very regular basis. This is at the back of your mind. You're working very closely with legal to ensure that there is, no sub data set left behind, or there is no subset left behind. How are you overall finding this journey? Is it stressful in terms of getting it right? What are some of the things that you're doing? How are you addressing this challenge, and what do you see the future of emotion recognition to be?
Historically, I used to think like emotion recognition as a problem to be solved, right? From a data science standpoint, you're like, hey, I have a signal, I have to figure out what is the emotion.
Yeah.
Since then, I've sort of changed my approach a little bit. We kind of need to build for the persona, right? When they are saying they want to detect emotion, what exactly do they care about? Are they only interested in looking at instances where a customer is angry when in the contact center, or are they looking for some other instances, right? And we've worked a lot with emotion detection. We've published a few papers as well over the years. Had a couple of patents filed around the same area. But the idea being, it's just not super accurate enough for it to fundamentally shift things, right? If you look at, like, there's Plutchit wheel of emotions, there's like different theories of emotion recognition. It's like some say there are 6 default emotions, some say there are 8, some just say forget about all of these, let's just do positive negative sentiment and get away with it. In general, rather than trying to sort of fixate on the emotion aspect of it, we are rather sort of focusing on the outcome of, like, hey, what is the end goal and how can we reach that end goal, rather than, because this is just a tool, this is just a technology on that side. But there are significant challenges, as you rightly said, in terms of validating these models and validating these models across a lot of cohorts. The cohorts could be just male versus female. The cohorts could then become much more complicated in terms of different races. The cohorts could be complicated in terms of just how loud, or like how is your pitch of your voice, which slightly correlates with your gender but does not necessarily always. So there is a lot of these cohorts, and academia is now sort of getting there in terms of, hey, can we standardize a lot of this? Can we sort of get to a point where we have solid benchmarks for not just emotion recognition but a lot of like AI models to identify what is bias within the models, right? And for us as a company, like for us at RingCentral scale, bias is one of the key aspects, and fortunately a lot of European legislators have already started thinking about this. Hey,
Yeah.
what is the outcome, what is the output of this model impacting somebody's livelihood?
Yeah.
Then you really need to do a lot of scrutiny. If the impact of this model, for example, if the end goal is just summarizing a meeting, it's not really going to change anybody's outcome of the day. Or so it depends on what is the result and what are you using the result for. If you're using, for example, if you're a recruiting company and you have an AI model which parses resumes and says yes or no, now that has a lot of pitfalls in terms of, hey, have we just done enough like testing around different types of applicants? And so we sort of and I just got off of a meeting with legal about a similar set of topics, is, hey, how do we sort of categorize? We categorize every single model. Hey, this is the model, what is its purpose? Does it really, what is the end goal? And we sort of outline those entire journey of the data lifecycle for the customer as well.
Have you hired a social scientist?
We don't have a social scientist on our payroll, but RingCentral actually does a lot of consultancies who analyze a lot of these outcomes for us, and not just for AI in particular, but a lot of, like, because we are a phone and communications company, we do a lot of analysis in terms of accessibility to, let's say, voice like the phone technology, or accessibility of creating video meetings versus what is the impact, what is the social impact for them. So there is a lot of interesting work which RingCentral also does along that side.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Sushant. It's been a wonderful conversation. It is really amazing to learn your story, right from IIT Bombay, from engineering to academics to scaling up a startup, coming here, different sets of challenges. How are you addressing them? And I hope that there's a lot of learning for a lot of folks.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for having me.